Hello everyone. My name is Stephanie Strifert, and thank you, David, for the introduction. And thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to see everyone here. So I'm originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, but now I've been in Edinburgh, Scotland for a little bit over a year. I have an academic and professional background in the built environment and architecture and sustainability. I studied environmental science and architecture for my bachelor's, for my undergraduate degree, and then I worked as a sustainability consultant and a service designer for a few years before doing my master's at the University of Edinburgh here in Scotland in the Design for Change program. And for that program, for my master's dissertation, I had to complete a design project over the course of 11 weeks, which focused on a global problem and a proposition for change through the medium of design. And I chose to do my research and my project on co-housing. So that's why I'm here. And as David said, that's how I got involved in choice and co-housing in Scotland. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the research portion of my project and not so much on the design portion, but if people have questions about that, we can talk about that as well. So the first question I wanted to answer for this is just why co-housing? And I chose to focus on it as my topic for my dissertation because I think it's an ideal mechanism for change in that it touches on both social and environmental issues, which are two categories which are often separated in our minds or in common discourse, but I have found are really closely intertwined and often depend on each other when you're looking at solutions. There are more issues than this and problems that co-housing addresses, but I'll briefly describe 5 of the kind of related issues that I found through my research that co-housing can address. So the first is that co-housing can lower greenhouse gas emissions, primarily because residents tend to have fewer square meters of living space per person, and so there's less space to heat, cool, light, less materials going into the building projects themselves. And then less space and an ability to share items easily between people can also lower resource consumption of co-housing residents. Co-housing can also reduce loneliness and isolation because it's easier for co-housing residents to socialize when they live close to their friends and they know their neighbors. And while it's not a guarantee, co-housing can be just as expensive as other models of housing to build. There are a number of mechanisms and models that co-housing can enact that make it more affordable for residents and can enable more security than renting possibly. And finally, co-housing can be a solution to managing an aging population because people of different ages and abilities and health can live together and support each other. So these are all things that I found kind of during my initial literature review, just on my desktop, on my computer with books, and they convinced me of co-housing many benefits. And then I set out to visit as many as I could and conduct my own research as part of this project. As David mentioned, I got a scholarship, a grant through my university to travel, which I was really lucky to do. And then also luckily I found a NGO, like a nonprofit group called Samenhuizen. And let me put a disclaimer that my Dutch and German is not great. So anything I say in Dutch or German, please ignore my pronunciations. But they are a group based in Belgium. They're a Flemish group that do a lot of programming around co-housing, and they have a community both online and kind of in person. And every summer they try to go on a tour. They came to the UK a few years ago, and this year they were going to the Netherlands and Germany over the summer. So I asked if I could join them and do some of my research while on their trip, and they agreed. And so I joined them and did a lot of my primary research with them. So just a brief overview of the trip. We left from Antwerp, Belgium on June 8th and went through the Netherlands and into Germany. The farthest east we got was to Berlin, and then we came back, and it was over the course of 5 days. We visited 10 co-housing communities, and each stop 1 to 5, a few exceptions, but members of each community gave us a tour and we were able to ask questions. And at some of them we stayed and had a meal with community members and got to explore and experience the communities a little bit more. So I'll quickly run through the stops we made on our tour, just kind of based on country. So in the Netherlands, we visited two pretty rural communities. The first was called Ecodor Zwiederveld, and it had about 90 people, and it was comprised of buildings arranged in a U shape around a communal garden in the middle. And the other was a relatively new community. They were doing a lot of construction still while we were there. And they had these kind of interesting donut-shaped residential buildings. I'm not sure if you can see from the picture on the right, but they were kind of circular buildings, and so people faced each other. And then they also had a farm with pigs and chickens. We then got to Germany, and most of the communities we visited there were in and around Berlin, but we also went to one in Hanover and one in Bad Belzig. And Berlin is an interesting case study because after the wall came down, and in '89, land prices were super cheap. But in the last couple decades, they have shot up exponentially. Like one article I read while we were there said that it's been by 400%. So some of the communities there were dealing with questions of whether to sell their buildings to developers. If people didn't have a pension, it was kind of this big relief sort of thing for high profits, or whether they valued more having the cooperative co-ownership model and wanted to stick with that and weren't willing to sell. So that was something that communities there were it was a big topic while we were there. The urban Berlin co-housing communities were also interesting because a lot of them had additional services and functionalities other than just housing people. So many had office spaces that they rented out to community members and outside businesses, like this one on the left, or community services like this one on the right, which had a bakery, a theater, a martial arts dojo, a health clinic, and other services within their community. And I noticed that the more services that a co-housing community had, the more the residents expressed that they felt integrated into the wider community. So that was like an interesting takeaway. Also in Germany, we visited some rural communities as well, some just outside of Berlin, and some kind of further out. And some of them, like the one on the left here, were modeled just kind of on traditional German villages, and that they're meant to be walkable with people knowing their neighbors, but it was still, everyone still had individual homes and a car, and many people commuted into the city to work. So it just kind of felt like an updated kind of traditional village model. But on the other hand, others like this one on the right were very community and communal focused with much more shared housing, and new members had to go through a year-long trial period before they were allowed to officially join the community. Everyone committed to working 10 to 20 hours a week in the community. And so whether people also had jobs outside of the community was a question, which was different than this other one. And people had meals together as well, like every meal together in their cafeteria. So there was a lot of diversity in terms of what co-housing meant, even within the rural communities in Germany, which felt like a specific subset. There was still just a lot of diversity between them. So then I ended my research trip at a co-housing community back in Antwerp, which one of the women on the trip with Samenhausen lived in. I was surprised to find that a good number of people on the trip already lived in co-housing, and they were joining the trip in order to see how other communities worked, figure out how they resolved issues and how they kind of had designed for certain things. So it wasn't just people who were interested in joining them, it was also people who already lived in co-housing communities. And then to end my research, when I got back to Edinburgh, to Scotland, I visited and conducted an interview with the Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op in order to have an example of a co-housing community here for my dissertation, which was based here. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the takeaways of this research. One of the exercises I did when I finished the trip was create a sort of inventory, a list of all the shared spaces and resources in the communities in order to understand how they were similar and how they were different, and whether there were any sort of non-negotiables. Was there anything that all co-housing communities had or that none of them had? And there were two things that all the communities I visited had. One was a common room or a house where members could come together, have meetings and share meals and just like have a common space. And the other was a workshop where people could fix things and build things together. And workshops actually came up a lot in the literature that I read about co-housing. There's a quote from one of the experts on co-housing in the US named Charles Durrett, who said, "Workshops play a big role in co-housing. People naturally want to get together to build stuff, repair stuff, and save money. Although workshops are actually more for building community than for building stuff." And I found that to be really true in my research. And at the Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op, they had a workshop that they had all come together to use to fit out what had been a car park, and they turned it into their common space. So it's kind of an example of both the workshop and the common space kind of coming together in a cool way. Another exercise I did after the trip was to consolidate kind of the main issues that were present in co-housing communities, not so that I could find anything wrong with co-housing as a model, but so that I could create a design project, which was required in my dissertation, to address them. And so the biggest issues that I found were that, one, buildings are not always well designed for successful cohabitation, and residents often do not have the technical knowledge to update them to design them better potentially. Two, co-housing community members need precedents. They need to know what's gone before in order to know what's possible. And three, co-housing communities need a way to work through issues that come up after construction, which is often after professional designers, if they had the capability to hire them, and consultants go away. So it's not a one and done sort of thing. So in order to address these problems, as I said, I'm not going to dive too deeply into this, but I'll just give you an overview of the design project.
Oops, we just lost you there.
Addresses those three problems that I just mentioned, because number one, a library requires no professional skills to use.
Now, Stephanie, we have got slightly flaky, no sound from you at the moment. So you'll just have to go back to beginning the description of your website. It may be help if you just turn your camera off for a minute. Oh, it's definitely gone altogether.
I'm back. I don't know what happened.
You could just try sharing again, Stephanie.
Okay.
It's sometimes you were just beginning to describe the evolution of your website.
Okay, sorry about that. My Zoom just disappeared. I was like, oh, everyone's gone. Okay, so I'll just say it addresses the three problems. You might have already heard part of this, but it addresses those three problems because a library doesn't require any professional skills to use, and so nobody becomes dependent on anyone outside of the community to access it. A library can include examples, images, and designs from existing communities as a way to provide precedents for new co-housing members or people who are coming up with issues that maybe weren't existent when they had the designer. And three, it can be used at any stage in the process by people designing their co-housing community, just moving in together, or those who've lived together for years where new things are coming up. Because as I said, like, living together is not a one and done thing. You never know what's going to happen, and new things come up all the time. So if you want to see the website, I believe it was included in the invitation, as well as a link to my dissertation. And here's a link to the website as well. And I will open the floor to questions. And thank you.
So if you unshare, that's lovely.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, we get some applause there from Mike and others, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for sharing. Now, what I'll do is I'll pin myself and you so that we can we'll start a conversation and see. You talked about the challenge of those buildings which had been built or designed by somebody over there, and so maybe didn't quite fit. Can you tell us any example where it did fit, it did work, and what had led to that happening? There's always been, and one of the 5 principles we always put is that it's co-designed by the intentional community, and so they have an understanding about the relationship between the common house and so on. But in your 10 or so visits, did you find an example of one where they told you the process that had led to a successful marriage between the people and the buildings?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the majority did fit and worked really well. There were just things that came up that no one expected or no one would be able to plan for. There was one example of one of the new projects in Belgium, in Antwerp, had been an updated old printing factory. The common house had been an old printing factory, and then they had built the new apartments kind of right with it. And one thing that they really intentionally wanted to plan for was sound isolation. So when they worked with the architect, that was like a big focus for them. And the person who gave me the tour said that she played the saxophone and had never had anyone complain that they could hear her playing the saxophone at whatever time of day she had lessons. But that was also something that they could really plan for and design for, because they were all involved from the beginning and knew that that was a priority for them. Sometimes if you're moving into a space that wasn't designed for co-housing, or you don't have as much of access to a professional designer, those are things that maybe you can't plan for as well.
Right. I was just drilling holes in my daughter's stud wall of an extension that was built about 20 years ago on a 1935 house, and the quilt insulation had been put up so far but no further, and there was a pathway over the wall between the kitchen and the bedroom. And so I think it takes a lot of very, very detailed site management as well, particularly. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge of the whole building industry in the United Kingdom. Now, I invite other people to pop their hands up. You can do this by going to reactions, and there's a little facility called raise hands, and then we can form a little queue. I saw Mike popping up there. He's always a great one for a few questions. So if you want to just ask your question, and also Gail, and we'll take that as a question, Gail, about financial models. So and you can talk about the financing of it. But Mike, do you want to just chip in your...
Yeah, fantastic presentation. Thanks, Stephanie. Really well delivered and really interesting in terms of its content. And forgive me, I haven't actually looked at the website, but is the purpose of the website to pull together all these different precedents that you refer to, so that prospective co-housing groups can investigate them and examine them and try and find a model that fits? I appreciate that it comes finally down to people's preferences, but did you find a kind of sort of sweet spot in terms of numbers of residents, how many hours they had to devote per week, how they came up, how they decided upon things and managed the projects?
Yeah, so 2 questions. I guess the first one is about the website, and the second one about ideal kind of situation. So yeah, the website, the idea is that I just seeded it kind of with 30 different topics and some examples in each one of things I saw at these communities. But the idea is that it would be this kind of bottom-up user-generated library. So anyone can comment or create their own topics and provide their own examples. And everything's given a Creative Commons license. So anything is free to use. And if someone uploads a design for something, anyone can use it. So that's the idea, is to kind of create this library that's always evolving and people can provide examples, and the co-housing community at large kind of builds it. The second question is a little bit harder to answer in terms of like ideal size, ideal structure. As I said about even just the communities within rural Germany, you know, there was a lot of difference in terms of size and structure. And there are a lot of examples out there, which is one of the reasons why I thought a library would be helpful, is to just be able to kind of pick and choose as a group from the examples that exist, which aspects work best. There are plenty of studies that can tell, that say, you know, 20 to 30 people is this ideal number and all of that. But it really depended on the community and what they were looking for. I will say one of the issues that came up again and again, kind of no matter the size, was just about how they founded themselves and the ownership model worked. And then an issue came up within X number of years with an aging population. So if you had to have basically the equivalent of a down payment on a house to buy in from the beginning, you had to have a good amount of capital to buy into the co-ownership model, which then people saved money on over time, but you kind of had to have that. It was a lot of people who already had capital saved. It was older people, established people and families. And then once, you know, their kids left, once they got older, they were coming up with issues of how do you bring new people in? And so I won't say there's like a perfect model, but kind of considering those things, I think is why I kind of created this library idea, because it was just a way to provoke the conversation.
Thanks. Just give a supplementary, if I may. In Scotland, there is a requirement, you know, for all kind of private developments to have quite a substantial portion that is affordable, and that's kind of a shorthand for an affordable rent as opposed to affordable owner occupation. Is there did you come across any projects that actually had quite a substantial rental element to their community, and how did that work in terms of inter-resident relations?
Yes, I will say, so the university, the Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op, which is university students at the University of Edinburgh, is a rental model that's maybe a little bit different than some of the other ones, but they pay £340 per month, which is very low in Edinburgh with people without the context for, you know, an apartment. And that's really just to keep kind of the building going. It just covers their operating costs, but that's like a rental model. At least one of, I believe it was the first place I visited in the Netherlands, had mostly owned units, but a good portion of them were rented, which created this opportunity for more turnover. And potentially they had said they had a lot of students who would come in doing research like I did for 6 months or a year. And it did create a dynamic that was more dynamic in their communities. And I can't so much speak to potentially like how the financial implications of like how you would establish a rental based co-housing community versus an owned one, other than with the ownership models, a lot of times, as I said, they were providing the equivalent of like a down payment where they had that like initial capital, whereas a rental model, maybe you couldn't expect that from people and you'd have to have that capital from somewhere else potentially. But once it was established, yeah, there were a good number of rental opportunities and did kind of create a little bit of more dynamic with people coming in and out.
Great, thank you.
And I wonder if we might invite Julia to come to the stage now. I'll remove Mike's pin and add your pin. Welcome, Julia. I don't recognize you, so I'm wondering where you're based, and so a little bit of background, if you like, before you ask Stephanie your question.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm based on the Isle of Lismore on the west coast of Scotland, and yeah, doing associated with building and sustainable building in different ways as a builder and as a student, and I'm also working with the local community trust on creating affordable housing. So just really interested in co-housing as a model kind of going forward, especially also for single people, because there's very little provision for one kind of single occupancy households in rural areas. So yeah, and I was interested as well in a bit in the design side, because I've read up a little bit about co-housing, and I don't know what you find in the communities, how people kind of strike a balance between living community, but then also what seems to be still quite an inherent need for individuality, and in a way having your private space, and that may be particularly affecting the shared spaces, the community spaces, like the workshops or the kitchens or the gardens, where people maybe have different ideas on how to do that, or people maybe, you know, kind of carve their little niches in those spaces that still feel more private. Or were there particular stories you came across or situations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the balance between public and private is a big topic within co-housing. And the question of how much personal space, like how big should the apartments or units, flats be per person versus the common space. I will say that the communities that were, you know, designing everything from scratch really did limit their personal space and focus on the common space, and then focus on having common space amenities like guest rooms. So, you know, nobody had an extra bedroom in any of the places I went to. It was always, you know, that they had a guest room that they could rent out or reserve or something like that. So a focus on that. I also think it's interesting. There's a lot of there's a lot of variety between totally private, this is my flat, and a really public area. And also a lot of need for that for small group kind of gatherings, because you might want to host something that you're bringing people in for, or have meetings or something like that. So I did notice that the places that had extra rooms where you could just close the door made it so
on
that
a Zoom meeting, Don.
Okay.
Did you want something?
She's trying to get my jag. I forgot to take it earlier.
I don't want
That's my
to.
last one for today.
Is that your new top you're wearing? No.
No,
Oh, hold on.
changed my bag, so I had to take.
Okay, muted.
Just get mute.
But basically just providing kind of options for people to be able to close doors so that you can have kind of this scale between what's totally private and what's totally public, made people actually use the public spaces more. And the metric that I came across in my reading was people hours. So how many hours of a day, a week, a month did people actually spend in the communal areas, was a way to like gauge whether they were actually useful. Because you could have something that everyone uses once a year, but again, it's this kind of idea of wasted space, and the fact that you have the economy of scale of everyone using it is what you hope to get out of it. If that answered, let me know if there was another part of your question that I missed.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Now, Gail, in the meantime, I think you've got two questions that you're. Oh, it's not Gail. Yes, Gail, would you like to ask your questions? Are you still there, Gail?
Yeah, no, okay, sorry, I feel I'm not entering the spirit of this, David, by not being, by turning my screen off. Thank you, Stephanie. Two things that interest me. One is the variety of financial models that we use for this. I mean, I'm aware, you know, they are quite different on the continent and quite enviable here. And the other is your views on the intergenerational living. You mentioned one of them was maybe more was for older people. That always goes slightly against the grain for me. I always think it's better to mix generations, but I'd be interested in what you feel is when it works and when it doesn't.
Yeah, so the first question about financial models, as you said, big diversity of where people are coming from when they start, and also the mechanisms that are in place location-wise where they are. I will say, you know, one of the models I talked about was just kind of this owned model where people have kind of the capital to build it, you know, themselves, and they just get traditional kind of loan sort of thing. Another one was what I mentioned with the students, where they had a building basically just donated to them, and in perpetuity it's guarded by an NGO and they just pay rent for upkeep. And then another model that I saw in Berlin was this kind of architect-led development, where a consortium of architecture firms had come together because they wanted to create co-housing. They were interested in designing that, and they got the, you know, like development backing. And then a lot of the architects chose to live in the community itself. So that was another model.
Do you know how they acquired the land in the first place? And, you know, was it serviced? Was it not? Was it service charge?
I do know that it was it was right after the wall came down. Specifically, I know this is very Berlin specific, but therefore the land prices were super cheap, but it was also a really risky investment. So one of the issues that they were coming into, as I said before, was around selling, was because they had put into their original like tenancy agreement that they could eventually sell, so that people would feel comfortable, you know, committing to something like that because they had an out potentially later. So there are ways, that was one way to like have people accept some form of risk by providing like options later. But again, that was very specific. I think it's always going to be, sorry,
and then intergenerational living.
Yes, intergenerational living. Yeah, I would say most of them went in with the idea that it was intergenerational at the moment, and then a lot of them were 30 years old at that point, and it had kind of aged into being the original people who had helped build it, had bought the property, all of that, were at retirement, were older, and then their kids had moved out, but there wasn't a place for them, for their kids to potentially like move back and own their own or have their own unit. I do think, yeah, the ideal is, in my opinion, this mixed age, because it provides this diversity in terms of ability and all of that. But there are also plenty of models where it is specifically for seniors, and then they plan for that fact and have the, you know, accessible design built in. One of the places I visited, they had specifically built an accessible like toilet and bathroom and like shower area that would all be accessible if anyone had a carer. And they had been talking about potentially bringing in a carer who would like work full-time for the community, would split their time between members. So I think it's about intentionality and like what you expect later, and planning. You know, a lot of this is about planning really far into the future and understanding that the demographics are going to change even if the original intention was mixed age. So I do think it's about, yeah, understanding what the ramifications are design wise as the years go on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Adam, I noticed that you're training as an architect and are interested in, and I'm wondering if you might share a few comments just from Stephanie's contribution this evening, and also your own research that you've been doing in terms of the project you're looking at in Perth. So I invite you, Adam, to, if you're up for it, to just chip in any you'd like to.
I mean, so we've just been looking at Perth, and currently we're in this kind of an analysis stage, looking at Perth, and then I'm here with Jenny as well.
Hello, sorry. We're in studio still.
Yeah, we've just been getting work done while listening into this very interesting presentation. But we're looking at ways we could potentially densify Perth, and unorthodox ways of adding housing that is accessible to everyone. So this has been really interesting. We've been particularly interested in the idea of shell build housing, similar to stuff that's happened in South America with Alejandro Aravena, stuff that people can move into and then add to, and be added to over time. So it's quite interesting to hear that actually happening in real life as opposed to just in a student project.
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting.
Do you want to add anything?
Oh yeah, just especially in terms of mixing demographics, I think we're looking at a lot of little like gap sites, and actually a way to sort of inject a bit more population, more energy, more movement into those spaces. And I think hearing about the way that you've got like older people and younger people working together as well, and looking, since it's like an aging population, how we can reincorporate people like over the age of 65 back into the city centre rather than feeling like they're being pushed out. So it's great to know that it is like a possibility rather than just something we read about. Actually hearing about it from someone who's gone to see it is really quite significant, I think.
I was really enjoying there's the quote earlier that was mentioned. It was workshops are for building communities, not just stuff. I've been thinking, I think, about ways to build community with housing and genuinely useful social spaces as part of those, as part of the housing projects. So that was nice and definitely something to look into.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Thank you.
Very cool. Yeah, it's cool to hear about your guys' projects too.
Yeah, we're
quite boring in comparison, to be honest.
We're pretty early on in the project right now, but we're by the end of the year we should be somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe not as interesting, but yeah.
So there are 3 people participating this evening who are in and around Perth, and maybe that we could find a way of putting you in touch.
That'd be excellent. Yeah,
that'd be really good.
Yeah, if you pour up for having a wee conversation, that'd be amazing.
Yes, definitely.
Great. If you could private message the 3 of you. You could private message to Adam, and
I can pop my email in if anyone would be up for getting in contact. That'd be amazing.
Now, Tom is a shy person. He's in the gloomy there. He's the convener of, and he's holding the reins, if you like, for Cohousing Scotland at the moment. And so I'd like to invite Tom to join in now and to say a few words or questions.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, great presentation, Stephanie. I was just wondering if you could talk a little about the kind of cultural context for co-housing in these countries. I guess on 2 levels. One, have these co-housing projects developed from a different culture around housing in these countries that is more collaborative and participative? And secondly, were these standalone projects, or were they offshoots from previous ones, or were they supported by a national network or strategy? And did it vary between the different countries? Or were they similar across the board?
Yes. So in terms of the cultural background, definitely coming from times and places that were more open to communal sort of situations and less of a focus on ownership. So part of my research for this dissertation was realizing that home ownership in the UK, like in the US where I'm from, is really important culturally, and is seen as, you know, a mark of distinction and like growing up, and something that you want to achieve at some point is owning versus renting. Whereas in some of these other contexts, like in Berlin, people do not expect to own necessarily, you know, like renting is something that's just like much more accepted and not like a mark of not having made it. Also, yeah, there is a long history of kind of communal housing environments in Scandinavia and then also in the Netherlands. But I would say that it wasn't as if everywhere was co-housing, and these were just a few examples. They still were pretty unique in their cultural context for how people were actually living today. And the second part of your question was, remind me, the cultural context.
Whether these were standalone or whether there was a national body like Cohousing Scotland, or they had sort of spawned from other co-housing projects already existing.
Yeah, there's definitely variety. And I remember the third part was kind of whether there was a variety within the countries, and there definitely was. One of the projects in Berlin had started in the 70s based on a group squatting in an old film production site. You know, so like that had started very differently than one of these kind of newer builds where there was this group Samenhausen, you know, as an example, like an NGO had started and people had gotten together and they found this property and developed it and created co-housing around it. And then the other one from the 70s had risen out of squatting, and then eventually the city had given them, you know, rights after X amount of years that they owned the land. So there was definitely a lot of diversity in terms of how they had come about. I would say most of them, though, were now involved in other co-housing sort of groups. So they were like part of this group Salmonhouse, this like Flemish group, or they were part of co-housing associations. Whether that like actively contributed to how they ran their day to day was very dependent, but it seemed like all of them, because we had visited them, were open to, you know, dialogue. They wanted to meet other groups, other people living in co-housing, and we're kind of part of this sort of movement at large.
Thank you, Tom. Now, Margaret, I wonder if you want to just chip in with your question, and this is to do with availability of land a lot of the time and the support. We're in a pretty paternalistic country in Scotland, and the council has to do everything or whatever, or doesn't do anything. But Margaret.
Yes, I'm interested in the role of the local authorities, Stephanie, and kind of just agree with everyone else that this is an absolutely brilliant presentation that you're giving us, and it's very comprehensive. I just wondered, it would appear that the local authorities on the continent are enabling, but I wondered if there is if there's enthusiasm for it. In other words, how has co-housing grown or not over the years? How is it viewed by local authorities, and are they ever involved as in co-production with groups in bringing forward co-housing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I can also, after I say a little bit, can point it over to Choice or Co-Housing Scotland, talk a little bit about their experience dealing with the councils and like how it works here. But yes, during my research, I would say that in the same way that culturally in Germany and the Netherlands and a little bit in Belgium, there was just more of an acceptance toward like different housing models. It was also a little bit more supported potentially by different government schemes. I don't remember specifically any of them saying that, you know, the government helped in big ways and had given them, you know, all sorts of things, but just having specific permits that were easier to get, you know, things like that just like facilitated and helped them along. I don't know. Yeah, I can't speak to how every country is viewing it. But it did feel like the government wasn't blocking it for the projects that we went to. It didn't make it extra difficult. Some of their other issues had come up were more around funding and figuring out answers to questions within the group and stuff like that. And it wasn't, I don't remember specifically anyone saying, well, it was really hard because the government doesn't support these kind of projects. Maybe, yeah, David or anyone else from co-housing in Southern Scotland can speak to specifically in Scotland or in Edinburgh.
Thank you, Margaret. That's I think it's a conundrum. We'll carry on, and we need to raise the awareness. So it's very, very heartening to have heard about the tutors at Duncan O'Jordanson School of Architecture in Dundee actually exploring these ideas. So that's helpful. But we need to lobby, we need to raise awareness and so on among elected representatives as well. Now, Norrie, I wonder if you can pop in.
Hi, Stephanie, that was really good. Thank you very much. I think just leading on from the last question I was going to ask in about sustainability-wise, if anything came to light about the benefits, you did talk about the social benefits, the isolation that was being addressed, but in financial terms, I wondered if any model had been produced where it demonstrated that the isolation saved the country money, whether having company like that reduced the NHS dependence. These are all things that we're considering, and are probably part of the financial package that we would need to present to the Scottish Government, which because the other thing that we're doing here, or we're considering here, is one or two efforts that we've made have looked at mixed communities. In other words, those with money and those that are affordable. And I wonder if the structure that they have a dual structure over there in terms of the ownership of the land and the operation of the rentals. So that's two different tax, but I don't know if that's clear enough for you to answer. I hope so.
Yeah, maybe the second one first was in terms of kind of mixed models. And that was one other thing that was an option, was people paying, one group had people just paying a percentage of their salary toward rent. So it was like the 1/3 number of their salary. And if their income changed, then the number changed of what they were paying toward the community. So that was one way of trying to have like mixed incomes and having people just pay their portion as a percentage. The first question, when you say sustainability, do you mean like longevity or environmental sustainability?
Both, really. It's about the social and, well, we're looking at the sustainability in terms of our carbon retention, in terms of reducing heating costs, making it more affordable that way, but also what are the benefits to society? I know there are the health and well-being policies that we have here and the likes. They're important things, and if we address those, there should be some reward for it, if you like, when you approach government or local authorities.
Yeah, I don't want to misstate the statistic, but something along the lines of single person households use 5 times as much, energy as when multiple people live together. And that wasn't the exact statistic, but basically just that the more higher density of people living together and sharing these resources, it's been shown they use just less resources, and it's greener in that way. The other aspect of it is more that when you see behaviors modeled by your neighbors, it's just way more likely people do them. So if your neighbors are far away behind closed doors and you don't see them, recycling and composting and like these green behaviors, it's a lot harder to start them yourself. And so I felt like in these communities, it was a lot easier for people to do them because there was kind of this reinforcing of someone did it, and so someone else felt unable to do it. And it just built up these kind of like green sustainable behaviors. And then in terms of health and all of these kind of things, I saw a very small number in the grand scheme of things, but I think the hope is, and based on my kind of literature review, that these kind of things do save the government money in terms of, as you said, NHS fees and cost of healthcare and things like that, because when people support each other and it's built into the mesh of the community, they don't have to outsource those things. And that is something that, there's kind of this general research right now, but the more examples that there are, the more communities that form, there actually can be more evidence that can be used to like support it and get government support.
Yeah. Were they built to a passive house standard, their properties at all, or?
Some of them, yeah. Some of them had, and passive house is originally like a German body. So especially the ones in Germany had focused on passive house. And there were also some of them where people really wanted to get involved in the building themselves. So they did like straw bale and like hay bale construction and had helped, kind of do that. There wasn't like, not necessarily passive house, you oftentimes have to go for certification and its own like bureaucracy, but definitely considering the environmental factors, if also that they were doing a new build and hired an architect, then that tended to be something that they wanted from an architect who was bidding for the project.
Yeah, certainly from a Cohousing Scotland perspective, and although this is a sales pitch if you like, but I would hope we would be building to passive house standard, not necessarily certified, but to that standard, so that whoever does it can have buildings that are healthy to live in, cheap to run, and will last for a long time. That's my suggestion. Right. Yeah. Thank you.
No, while I've got you up there still pinned, I'm wondering if there was any of your gleanings from the Radical Housing Conference in Bristol that you want to share just now, in terms of the social and community component of housing. So it's not anyway. I'll leave it with you. Any points?
It was interesting. It was there were a lot of people who spoke well, and what it did was gave people encouragement and belief in themselves that communities can make a difference and will make a difference. And co-housing is about communities. The benefits that we bring are there for all to see. But interestingly, it was sponsored by Agile Homes. Their model is really interesting. They're prefabricated stuff, and they went through it and showed They built the panels and they're filled with straw, timber frame built with straw. The very first one they did took 2.5 days to put up the framework of the house, but it now takes 4.5 hours to put up a house. And they, as Adam was saying about students, they look at corner sites, gap sites, and they work on small sites all over the place with different councils. They don't buy the land though. And one of the things I think that came out of it, I felt, was the opportunity for co-housing, where we're bound by local authorities on the basis that the Minister for Housing doesn't give a fig. The way forward might be to consider approaching local authorities and working with them and partnering with them and look for a long lease and be able to then create affordable housing. So I think there's quite a lot for us to consider and investigate going forward, because right now the financial model in this country is prejudiced against co-housing. You are seen that you must be rich to do it. It is only those that have the money. And there was a journalist at that meeting who brought that up at the conference on Friday afternoon. He said it is seen that what's that Adam's asking? Agile homes. But he actually said that there's a perception that it's people who are better off that can afford to do it. And frankly, regardless of your age group, and listening to what Stephanie's been saying, it appears that most of the people in co-housing groups have to have their own money to a large extent. Is that fair to say, Stephanie?
I would say that it's just harder, as it is with a lot of things. Just you have to kind of find other mechanisms than just like traditional financing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I'm working on an idea of how we're going to have to go about it in Scotland. This might not be the right time to say anything about it at the moment.
One other thing I'll mention is community land trusts, which maybe we've talked, that's another like model of how, as you were saying, with like these like 100-year leases and things like that, I don't have too much of a background in, but there are models like that allow groups to kind of come together.
But their CEO actually was talking at the Radical Housing Conference, and in England, certainly, and there was the difficulty of being at that conference, it was very English-based and very English prioritized, but they're saying that if you set up a community group, the Community Land Trust will assist you to buy land. Now, if you use it it can use it for housing if that is the aim of the Community Land Trust, but it has to be, and it's something I think we need to look at a lot more closely, certainly in Scotland. I don't suppose they have an equivalent of that in Germany or Belgium that we're aware of? Or
yeah,
they
there was one of the people involved from Belgium was really involved in community land trust there. It is like a wider model, and they have them in the States, I think, as well.
Oh, right, that's useful to know. That's something we'll have to look at certainly a lot further, I think.
David, Paul's hand is raised. Is he wanting to speak?
He's next.
All right.
It's very nice to see you, Paul. You've got such a lot of experience seeing this ecological sustainability aspect of the buildings, but I'm not sure if that's your question, but you chip in with your question.
Okay, well, I'm on my third cow housing scheme in Cornwall, and I'm still a director of others. And there are ups and downs, and fundamentally it's about relationships, not buildings. Everybody should understand it's about relationships, not buildings. And what we have discovered is that trying to legislate for relationships is like banging your head against a brick wall. You just have to take time and do the work and accept that some people won't fit. And you might be one of the ones who don't fit. The other thing I wanted to raise was mutual homes ownership, which is the model that Lilac uses, that the co-housing schemes in Cornwall mostly use, where you don't have to have capital to be a member. You will typically have a mortgage from Triodos or Ecology, and something like 30 or 35% of capital is raised by people who have got capital, but you can have people who are members, as long as they can pay a charge, a service charge, to essentially cover their proportion of the mortgage. Then it's workable. So there is and that works I'm told, works well at Lilac, and Lilac even have variable payments according to income. So there are other options out there. What else? Most people want passive house, but some people can't afford it. You know, that's the truth for anybody building their own house as well as anybody in co-housing. And what can you say? We've recently, on the co-housing I'm living in, we've recently been building 2 log cabins as replacement community buildings, one for kitchens, one for meetings and stuff. And excuse me, it does a great deal to bring the community together to do that kind of building work. And what else can I say? Co-housing is a growth. Scotland is different to England without a shadow of a doubt. You know, I'm tempted to move to Scotland, because why would you want to live in Richie Simmock's England? But there you go. I could lots of things I could say, but you know, everybody's got a space to contribute. So thank you for listening.
Great. Are there any other questions that people have got in mind? Any hands up? Margaret, again, yes, do. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, David. Can I come back to Stephanie and ask, what is the trend with co-housing on the continent? Is it increasing or decreasing, or is it staying much the same? Does it have a place and it's respected, but there isn't it's pretty stable? Or is there a dynamic? Is it increasing or reducing?
Yeah, based on my research, co-housing was increasing everywhere that I looked. I wish I could find quickly the image of the graph of just like searches for the word co-housing, you know, like Google searches, just was like an exponential graph. People are really interested post-COVID, potentially post, you know, like economic shock and with inflation, all of that, as like also in a like affordable housing model, but also just like, yeah, maybe post-COVID in terms of people feeling isolated and wanting to kind of find that form of in-person community, that it's the interest in it is increasing a lot. And then now it just has to be that we find these kind of mechanisms we keep talking about to enable it. So I don't know if like co-housing is growing as much as interest is growing, which is potentially just a good sign that if there's this whole group of people who are interested in it, now we're going to have all these people to solve the problem of how do we actually build it.
Thank you.
Well, Stephanie, you said that you are really sharing mostly your own experience of visiting these, but for your design project, you were, and I think Nori maybe asked a question about what, oh no, sorry, Mike Wilson early on asked, what's the purpose of this website? So I'm wondering if you can share your screen and just take us through a little bit of this website, because from the little bit I saw of it, it was to be a sort of holding bucket for lots of different case studies and experiences and model protocols and so on. So
yeah, I'm happy to share it. So this is the library page of the website. I had no coding skills before this, so it's relatively rudimentary. But the idea being, I'll click into some of these cards, but that there are all these topics, and each one includes case studies and examples, and then also the ability for users, anyone on the website, to add their own either comments, case studies within each one, or their own, which would show up in this library. So for example, we'll go to workshop, just one of the 30 kind of seed topics I put in there. So I explained that quote that I had just said during this talk about workshops building communities. Also, if you don't have room for a workshop, there are things called maker spaces, which lots of cities have, which you can have a membership to basically place a workshop, an external workshop. And then each one has examples. So this is one in Germany that I visited, one in, then that one's also in Germany. and then this one in Antwerp. So each one is like this and each one is tagged with kind of different topics that it might be. So workshops that were around efficiency and sharing, and then the ability for people to add comments. So the whole idea is that it's a library that's seeded with some things based on my research, but then also has these opportunities for people to provide their own examples or comments for each of these kind of topics. So that one was about sharing food, sharing a calendar, kind of all these topics that came up again and again in the ones that I visited.
So, for those of us in Co-Housing Scotland who are wanting to evidence that this works and that people, and there are some of us here this evening who are just starting out in thinking of these things. Are you envisaging that this might have life beyond you've submitted your dissertation and so on, but what are your plans and your thinking at the moment in terms of keeping it alive?
Yeah, I mean, I did set it up so that it could continue and paid for the domain and stuff, with the hope that it wouldn't just end up forever lost in the ether once the dissertation was done. So yeah, the idea would be to hopefully have people continue to use it and to upload, their own things. And I think it's the kind of thing where there has to be kind of some momentum, and then the ball starts rolling and people use it. So yeah, that's the idea.
Oh, that's something for the communications circle in Co-Housing Scotland to think carefully about. Stephanie, just so everybody who's still online, I'm amazed everybody's staying on for so long. We'll wrap up very shortly and finish well before 9, I hope. But thank you all for staying on for so long. But Stephanie, can I just invite you to put the web address? I know it's been mentioned before. Gail, I'll use the opportunity for you to just have a shout out about the coming events that you have been organising, which are so well organised and so well with multiple speakers. Gail, do you want to just chip in?
Thank you, David. Yes, we've got the third in a series of 4 coming up. I've just put a link to it in the chat box. Building Futures in Rural Scotland, 3, How to Help Communities. So that might be of interest to some of you. There was reference to local council earlier, and our last one, number 2, which was on the 9th of October, was aimed at local councils and what they can do, how they can be proactive in leading the revolution in alternative housing models. That recording should be going up any day now. It's possibly up by now on our website, and I would strongly recommend listening to that if you have an interest in what local housing, local authorities could or should be doing. I mean, just the people coming to number 3 are Ariane Burgess, Green MSP, who is leading a lot on this. Kate Hagman, a fairly enlightened councillor, Ewan McLachlan from Asset Development Trust, Polly Chapman from Impact Hub Inverness. It's not just about housing, it's about placemaking. So we want to talk about workspaces, as you have done, Stephanie. And yeah, 3 more. It's all on the website on the link. So hopefully maybe see you there. But if not, recordings are available on our website. Thank you, David, for letting me do that.
Just before we go to Becca, I should unpack what CEDA stands for. That's Scottish Ecological Design Association. I originally trained as an architect a long time ago, so I've been a member for ages and ages. But CEDA Land is Gail's baby of sharing knowledge and peer-to-peer exchange of knowledge and ideas and experience. And so not only in these upcoming events, but in some of the past events, there have been some very challenging and very interesting things. So in terms of Adam and you and your colleagues, you might have a quick look at that as well. But it's a delight to invite our colleague Becca from across the pond. How are you doing?
Thank you. Well, actually, my question, somebody else asked Stephanie, what are your next plans? Are you going to come back to Minneapolis area where you're from? We could use some help in co-housing over here.
Maybe eventually. I do have a job here in the UK, working for a company based in London who's creating software to analyze the carbon in construction materials. So for architects to make better choices around their embodied carbon in their architecture projects. So relevant to this work, but yeah, hopefully I'll also be able to bring that company and make it relevant to the States as well.
So it's an aside. Some of us have been talking a little bit this evening about passive house, green, addressing the climate emergency and so on. I remember Howard Liddell always talking about how yes, you can reduce the amount of carbon emitted each year in the lifetime of a building, of a house, but what about the amount of carbon that's used in constructing it? And as the annual use goes down dramatically, it really is very important. Actually, what you build the building about of, that's where Norrie MacPhail was talking about this company building with straw bales. That's captured carbon, and so that's carbon negative in some respects. There's embodied carbon within the construction material, whether it's timber, if it's a natural material that's grown. And of course, Tom's got lots of experience on that, so I'll invite him to come in on that. Thanks for joining us, Becca.
Just briefly, seeing you've stirred that pot, David. I guess, and I should say I'm a director of CEDA as well as being co-housing, just to put that on the record. That I think the point that Stephanie made about the advantages in sharing for efficiency and increasing occupancy is quite an important one in terms of the just transition to net zero for buildings and construction, where the Scottish Government's due to launch its national strategy early next year. And I think in terms of trying to get progress on support from public bodies, that will be quite a useful argument to make. And I don't know if there's data that you have links to, Stephanie, that would help in that, but it's quite an interesting thing. It's something, you know, that people have been working on modeling these strategies. And I think there's a broader thing across society about the needing to share resources more that co-housing sits within, and is a really interesting example from some of those European colleagues.
Yeah, I'll reshare, I'll send it one more time too, the link to my dissertation. It doesn't include a ton of that data, but at least in the index as well, you'll see plenty of reports that I use the research from that have those kind of arguments.
Certainly there's a wonderful book called Resilient Together by a North American author who's done research on 3 different co-housing communities and eco-villages in North America, and this shows that the intimately measured carbon footprint of the per capita of these 3 communities, Dancing Rabbits, Twin Oaks, and another whose name I can't remember, showed that they were 90% less than the US citizens' average carbon footprint each year. And this would be for a variety of reasons. They weren't driving 100 miles in 2 directions to get a job, to pay for the mortgage and so on. They were working locally, but also they had 20 years ago invested in in solar panels and extended that, so they got their own microgrid and so on, so that they were no longer so reliant on the national grid for power, and certainly not so much fossil fuels as well. Stephanie, it's been an absolute delight to hear your experience. Thank you so much for sharing your travels so generously. Yeah, everybody's enjoyed this.
Thank you.